Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So nice to see all of you. My wife and I are very pleased that we could join you today. This being September, the new school year has started for many people, so I thought I would share some thoughts on learning. Specifically, what does learning mean in the context of Buddhism? So let's start by thinking about learning in general. It begins soon after we're born. A newborn has certain physical and emotional needs. Many of these needs are satisfied just by instinct, but there's also learning taking place. The child finds out what to do so that mom and dad will satisfy his or her basic desires. Later, after gaining language skills, the learning process becomes more conceptual. We start to acquire ideas about the world, ideas that go beyond our immediate desires. For example, at first we find meaning in the food on our plate, just as it is. It's just food. Later, we can attach meaning to food as a concept. We are able to think about it as an abstract idea. With the acquisition of language, we become questioners, people who ask what, how, and why. And at a certain stage of our lives, we ask questions endlessly to the point of exasperating our parents and teachers. Human beings come equipped with natural curiosity, the desire to understand the world and our place in it. Sustaining this curiosity throughout our lives is lifelong learning, a goal that many people embrace. Use it or lose it is a good motto for physical fitness, but it also applies to our mental abilities. So many of us try to learn new things to stay sharp. Sadly, people can be overwhelmed by difficulties and can lose their natural curiosity. They cease to be learners. Another way to lose our curiosity is to become cynical or ideological. Presented with something new, we say, been there, done that, or don't bother me, my mind's made up. We stay in the comfort of our ego-centered version of reality. It seems to me that to lose one's natural curiosity is to cease being truly human. It is to abandon the search for meaning in life. What about learning in Buddhism? Is this learning a lifelong process? Now, of course I'm going to say that the answer is yes, but getting to that point is not as obvious as you might think. There is one kind of Buddhist path on which the goal is to put an end to learning. This may come as a surprise to us. Let me emphasize that the Buddhist stage of non-learning is quite different than the ego-centered loss of curiosity that I mentioned a moment ago. I think it's helpful for us to understand what the non-learning stage is and to see why it does not occur in Shin Buddhism. That's the tradition followed at this temple. If we go back 2,500 years to the time of Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, the path for Buddhist monks was called the Way of the Hearers. The Sanskrit word for these early disciples is Shravakas, or hearers of the Buddha. Keep in mind that these disciples were monks who renounced secular life. Shakyamuni had many other disciples who were not monks, but rather lay people, and they followed a different path. A monk, by listening to the Buddha and practicing his teachings, could become an arhat, a worthy one. The great disciples like Shariputra and Moggallana, they were all arhats. They had the same attainment of nirvana as Shakyamuni. The only difference was that a Buddha realized nirvana on his own, while an arhat did so by listening to a teacher. This way of the hearers was a slow process that might require many lifetimes of practicing. If a disciple had enough good karma, he could be a monk and advance through a series of stages in which the passions were eradicated one by one. He became first a stream enterer, then a once returner, then a non-returner, and in his final lifetime, a fully awakened person, or arhat. An arhat, having cultivated wisdom and having eliminated delusion through a long period of learning and practicing, realized the highest stage attainable by a disciple of the Buddha. He was described as someone who had nothing more to learn. That brings us back to our topic for today. Let's consider what it would mean to have given up learning in Buddhism. The Japanese term for this stage is mugaku. Gaku is learning. Gaku. For example, daigaku means higher learning or the university. Mu, the character, is negation, hence mugaku is non-learning. It is the stage in which all religious practice has been completed and nothing remains to be accomplished. Mugaku is the stage of one who has realized nirvana. There is also the term gakunin, referring to a person at the learning stage, a disciple whose practice is incomplete. For a gakunin, delusion has not been eliminated, and there is still something to learn. It is the stage of a disciple who has not yet become an arhat. Shakyamuni Buddha describes his own liberation this way. My heart's deliverance is unassailable. Destroyed is birth and death. The spiritual life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no more coming back to any state of being. The first part, my heart's deliverance is unassailable, well, that means that nothing can undo the realization of his nirvana. Buddhahood for him is irreversible. Birth and death refers to existence in samsara, that is, death and rebirth in this world of delusion. As far as Shakyamuni was concerned, the samsaric mentality that leads to rebirth was destroyed within him. Clearly, this describes a person who had no further questions to ask and nothing more to learn. He had extinguished greed, anger, and delusion. That was the meaning of Buddhahood for the monks who followed the way of the hearers. It's the Buddhahood described in the Pali scriptures. This path of personal liberation culminated in mugaku, or non-learning, when all questions had been answered. Shinran, depicted here, is the founder of our tradition, and he lived in Japan 16 centuries after Shakyamuni. In that time and place, he found that the way of the hearers was no longer accessible. He considered Buddhist practice and realization on that path to have died out long before. He could not become an arhat by listening to a living Buddha. Being filled with blind passions, I am unable to liberate myself from birth and death, whatever practices I may carry out. Shinran recognized that the ego is able to convert everything to its own use, even spiritual practices. That is why monastic life became a hindrance for him. It only served to feed his religious ego. With no living Buddha to guide him, Shinran was unable to follow the way of the hearers and to eradicate his passions. That way was extinct as far as he was concerned, and so he abandoned monastic life. Then, as a student of Honen, Shinran found a life of awakening in the teaching of the larger Sutra of Immeasurable Life. For him, Jodo Shinshu, or Shin Buddhism, was the path that was vital and flourishing. In the larger sutra, Shakyamuni states that this particular teaching will endure even when all of the other sutras have become extinct. People who hear the meaning of Namo Amida Butsu will be liberated despite their living in a time when Shravaka practices are no longer possible. Rather than the ideal of mugaku or non-learning, the larger sutra teaches the aspiration for limitless learning. This is the meaning of the San Butsuge verses that we just chanted. One of its lines says, "Nothing surpasses my determination to seek the way, steadfastly and untiringly." Limitless seeking. Rather than eradicating the passions and becoming an arhat, the larger sutra teaches a life of awakening with the passions intact. So, recall the way of the hearers, where a disciple was gradually transformed from a foolish being to an arhat by eliminating the passions. Contrast that with the Shin Buddhist life of awakening, which does not involve upward advancement. We remain foolish beings, but we have a new awareness of our situation. In one sense, nothing changes. In another sense, there is a complete transformation of our perspective. If you've been in the VCA for a while, you've probably heard the phrase, "You are saved just as you are." That's the way they used to talk about this. In a sense, that's correct, since we do not cease to be foolish beings. But I think the statement is misleading if taken to mean that we can and should do nothing. That is far from the case. Transforming our perspective and becoming aware of our situation requires ceaseless effort, but it is effort that we cannot take credit for. In Shin Buddhism, we never stop learning. So the ideal is not mugaku, but rather gakunin, a stage of still having a lot to learn. One of my teachers explained it this way. If you attain enlightenment, you may have no further need for Buddhism. However, foolish people like us must study endlessly. I learned from teachers, and I learned from my passions. This, I must say, does not mean acquiring academic knowledge. Awakening in Shin Buddhism means understanding that I am a foolish being, a person who trusts in his abilities and who swims against the flow of impermanence. To ask questions is the essence of this type of learning, which has been called the narrow road to the interior self. The most important question to be asked, I think, is, what am I? What am I? Or, put in a different way, what is the meaning of Namo Amida Butsu? On the narrow road to the interior, there is no final answer to our questions. We spend our whole lives asking them. Asking and learning is itself the goal. In Shin Buddhism, the only transformative practice we perform is listening to the Dharma. To listen to the Dharma means attending talks and seminars, as well as reading and reflecting on our own. The other things we do along the way, like chanting and meditating, and those are good things to do. They may be helpful, but they are actually not essential. This listening-only approach might sound like we have reinvented the way of the hearers, but I see some crucial differences. We cannot receive the Dharma directly from Shakyamuni. Our teachers are ministers and Sangha members, all of whom are foolish beings, not Buddhas. In this type of Sangha, everyone has limitations. There is no guru. We also receive the Dharma through everyday difficulties that show us our blind passions. There is no end to the difficulties that teach me what I am. I must be open to learning from them. Otherwise, I am not genuinely listening to the Dharma. Whatever teaching comes my way, I must engage with it and ask, what does this tell me about myself? As Shin Buddhist followers, we never arrive at the non-learning stage. We embrace lifelong learning, the narrow road to the interior. Seeing as how we still have a lot to learn, I hope that we will retain our curiosity and will keep asking questions. Naman.